Hello everyone, I am Chandana Alavattagi and welcome to my lecture on case study method. So here in this lecture, I am trying to provide you with a broad but introductory understanding of case study method. So you might be thinking about the possibility of using a case study in your dissertation project. So in terms of learning objectives, after following this introductory lecture, and most importantly, after reading the recommended reading for this particular topic, you should be able to first explain the philosophical basis of case study research. 2. Differentiate between a case study research from a sample-based study or research. Then you should also be able to differentiate between two types of case studies that we normally come across: the educational case studies and the academic or the analytical case studies. And most importantly, you should be able to understand and appreciate the manner in which your choice of a case study research method would affect or frame the key element of the research process, which are defining your research issue, the literature review, data collection, data analysis, discussions and conclusions, and finally, how do you report your case study findings. Your dissertation is a research project, and the case study method is a research methodology. Therefore, it is a good idea to start our discussion with a fundamental question of what do we mean by research? So, what do we mean by research, especially in the context of understanding case study method? Perhaps a good starting point is to start with the dictionary meaning of research. So let's go to Oxford Dictionary. So this is how the Oxford Dictionary defines research. So in this definition, the most critical part for me is the last sentence, which is a course of critical or scientific inquiry. So research is a critical or scientific inquiry. However, this particular definition is missing something. That is, what is the outcome of research? The outcome of research is the construction of knowledge. So in that sense, we can little bit expand this particular definition to say that research is either a scientific or critical inquiry through which we construct knowledge. Or more precisely, it is either critical or scientific inquiry through which we construct justifiable, acceptable, legitimate knowledge. So the research is understood as a legitimate, politically correct process through which we have to create knowledge. So we make our political decisions, social decisions, and our managerial decisions, policy decisions based on the knowledge created through research. So for example, regarding various policy issues, say for example regarding COVID-19 pandemic situations, the government tells to people do certain things and not to do certain things and so on, based on medical research, scientific research. So the knowledge created by that scientific research becomes the epistemological basis or the knowledge basis upon which we justify our actions, our decisions, and our thinking. The research provides that particular outcome, that is knowledge. Now, that definition of research and the centrality of the concept of knowledge in that definition of research takes us to another important question. That is, what do we mean by knowledge? In a broader sense, knowledge is the way we cognize, understand, and explain the reality. So the notion of reality is a very fundamental concept in understanding what do we mean by knowledge. For example, in your research project, you have a research question or a research problem. That research question or the research problem or the research issue is a statement about a particular problematic reality condition. So there is a particular reality condition, a reality situation that you want to explore, that you want to understand, and that you want to come to know and explain. That is because that particular reality condition is either problematic, some puzzling condition. So you do a research in order to understand, to explore, to test and explain this particular reality condition. So the reality is the thing that we come to know. So therefore the knowledge is the way we understand, explain and cognize a given reality situation. Now, when we are thinking about this connection between knowledge and the reality, we have to ask a fundamental question: whether that reality is generalizable, whether that particular reality condition I am going to explore is equally applicable to other conditions, other situations, other people, other companies, other countries, and so on. Whether the knowledge I construct by studying that particular reality situation, that particular sample, or that particular case, or that particular company, or that particular set of respondents can be generalizable to a larger population, to a larger condition. In other words, is the reality is such that we can create a universally acceptable knowledge by studying the reality? Or is the reality is non-generalizable condition? So that is a very important question we have to always ask. Whether the particular reality problem or reality question or your research question or research problem signify a condition which is generalizable or not. And this differentiation between, or this understanding of the generalizability of the reality condition and the generalizability of the knowledge that you create by studying that reality condition is a very important consideration when we are talking about the case study method as a research methodology. To emphasize it again, because it is very important, the generalization or the generalizability of the given reality condition, and therefore the knowledge that you construct by studying or exploring that reality condition is an important consideration in deciding whether the case study method is an appropriate methodology for your research or not. Now, with that emphasis on the notion of generalization or generalizability, we need to make an important comparison between two methodological concepts: sample versus case. Now, when it comes to sample or sampling, it is used mainly in natural sciences such as medicine, chemistry, biology, and so on. In a very similar fashion, sampling is also used by the mainstream positivistic accounting researchers, finance researchers, and the mainstream economics and management researchers. And such mainstream researchers are generally following the research doctrines of what we call positivistic research or hypothetico-deductivism or hypothesis testing. In such research, they make a specific assumption about the reality. So they conceive the reality that they are studying as a particular totality, as a totality that constitutes of more or less similar items. To repeat it again, for these researchers who uses sampling or samples, the reality is a totality. And that totality constitutes of more or less similar items. And they have a word for this particular totality. that they're studying. They call it population. That's the statistical term they are using. So they are studying this totality or the population. And their aim, their objective is to make a knowledge claim, a conclusion about that totality or the population. However, studying the population is impossible. Studying the population can be very costly, time consuming, and even destructive because of the nature of the study or the test that you are carrying out. For example, when a doctor wants to have a blood test for me, he or she can't test every blot of blood in my body. That will be very dangerous, very destructive, and I will be dead. Instead, very efficiently, very effectively, the doctor can take a small amount of blood from my body and test it. So by testing that particular sample, the doctor can make a conclusion about the total amount of blood in my body. That's the population. So in case of sampling studies, hypothetical deductive studies, you study a sample to arrive at a conclusion regarding the population. The conclusion is for the population, but the analytical focus is on the sample. So this connection between the sample and the population is the generalization or generalizability. And that generalizability is very often expressed as a probability, as a confidence interval, confidence level, 99% sure, 95% sure. A researcher would say, I am 99% sure that my hypothesis would be accepted for the population under this statistical sample statistics. So that is sampling. So to repeat it again, to emphasize it again, sampling is used under the condition of generalizability or generalization. So when the reality you are studying is composed of more or less similar items, or in other words, when the reality is a totality that is constituted of more or less similar items, and by studying a representative sample of that particular totality or population, you can arrive at a valid conclusion about the totality. So that is where the sample works. So that is how the sample is used as a mean of making a knowledge claim. So that's sampling. Now, when it comes to the case studies, we are in the opposite side. Case studies are used in a condition of realities which are not generalizable, or generalization is meaningless. Now, in social sciences such as sociology, anthropology, and so on, as well as in critical accounting research, critical management research, critical finance research, and so on, the researchers think about the social reality not as a totality that composed of similar items, no. So therefore, for these critical researchers, these sociological researchers, the totality is not a homogeneous totality. The totality is heterogeneous. What that means? The totality constitutes of different items. And each of these items or each of these elements which constitute the totality is unique, is particular. And each of these elements of the totality contribute to the totality, makes the totality in a unique way, unique fashion. Now, therefore, when you are studying an element or a few elements of this particular totality, that cannot give you a generalizable understanding about the totality empirically. So there is no statistical means of generalization in there. You cannot empirically generalize or statistically generalize what you are studying in a small element of the totality or one element of the totality towards the totality. So non-generalization is there because each element is unique, each element is particular. So in that kind of a scenario, what is important is not the generalizability, not the generalization. Instead, what is important is the uniqueness, particularity or the idiosyncrasy. So the case studies are trying to tell a unique narrative, unique story, a unique argument, a unique conclusion about a particular case, and how that particular case contribute towards the totality, how that particular case behave, act, work, and do things. So that is a uniqueness. So some researchers, as I identify in some dissertations, for example, previous year students, they very often say, I am doing a case study, and one problem of the case study, one big weakness of the case study is that it is non-generalizable. To a certain extent, you might say so, but so this non-generalizability of the case study is not necessarily a weakness. If you clearly think about it, if you understand your realistic situation in such a manner that the reality is non-generalizable in its own way, then generalization is impossible, generalization is meaningless, and generalization is useless. So therefore, the non-generalizability of the case study is not necessarily a weakness. That's a strength. Because why? The reality is such. So when the reality is non-generalizable, trying to make a generalizable claim is a false claim. So you can argue, nope, here is my case. And this case is a unique, specific story. And you can't find this story anywhere else. It is here. So that is the important thing. So to repeat it, to emphasize it again, in the case of case studies, the particularity, uniqueness, or the idiosyncrasy is important than the generalizability. This is exactly the way the law consider the cases. We all know that the law has universal doctrines, universal principles, general principles, and the general laws. But all these legal doctrines, legal principles, and laws, when they are going to be applied on an individual case or individual in the court, so that individual's specific circumstances has to be considered. Each individual has to be considered as an individual case when you are going to apply more or less generalizable, universal doctrines, laws, and principles. So that's where the case study is coming from. Yes, there might be some universal principles, but that universality has to be conditioned. That universality has to be framed by the particularity of the specific case. So what is more important? The manner in which that particular case or that particular individual or that particular unit or that particular entity is different. So the difference matters. So when the difference matters, you go for what? Case studies. So that is the basic difference between sampling and case studies, which is whether you are facing a reality condition which is generalizable or not. If it is generalizable, go for sampling. If it is not generalizable, go for case studies. Now, our discussion so far concentrated on empirical or statistical generalization, which is not applicable for case studies. However, there is a particular form of generalization applicable for case studies. And that is what we call theoretical generalization or analytical generalization. Now, when we are talking about generalization, whatever the form of generalization that we are talking about, generalization include basically connecting two things. First, we have a total, and there is element of that total. So the generalization means connecting a specific element of the total with the total. Connecting the smaller element with the bigger thing. So in empirical generalization or statistical generalization, that connection is made using statistics. So the total is conceived in the name of population. The element is conceived or conceptualized in the name of a sample. So the total is represented by the statistical jargon of population. The element is represented by the statistical jargon of sample. The connection is made by statistics, probabilities, hypotheses, and so on. Now, when it comes to the theoretical generalization, we still have the same connection. We still have the total. And we still have the element, the case. So we have to make a connection between this element, the case, and the total. But in post-positivistic research, in critical research, the total is not conceptualized as a population, in a statistical population. But it is conceptualized in its very organic, in a very native, in very natural form. For example, the total may be the economy. The total may be the polity. The total may be the society. The total may be the industry. The total may be the culture. And so on. So there is a particular total we are thinking about here. That's a very natural political category, social category, cultural category. Or the total can be the classes. So like that, a particular totality is conceived in theoretical terms, not in statistical terms. Now, such conceptualization of totality depends heavily on the particular theory that you are going to use. For example, if you are using neoclassical economics, the totality is always the macroeconomy or industry or something like that. And on the other hand, if you are going to use Marxist labor process theory, the totality might be conceived as a what? The classes, the capital, the mode of production, and so on. So totally depending on the theoretical angle you are using, you conceive a particular totality. That totality can be a network. That totality can be a set of institutions. Or that totality can be cultures. So there is a totality but conceived in terms of theoretical propositions, theoretical concepts, and theoretical doctrines. Now, you are trying to connect your case-specific observations, case-specific analysis with such theoretical categories, theoretical concepts, theoretical doctrines, then you are making what you call theoretical generalization. So theory becomes the tool through which you interpret your data. Now in empirical generalization, it is the statistics through which you analyze your data. You calculate the mean values, you calculate the standard deviations, you calculate the regressions, R values, P values, and so on. And on the basis of such statistics, you interpret and you accept or reject your hypotheses. Now, when it comes to critical research, instead of such statistics, we have theories as our analytical device, sensitizing device. So that is the devices through which we make a sense of the data we have. So, in that manner, if you are using the theory to interpret the data, to provide a broader meaning to the case-specific observations, that's what we call theoretical generalization. So the theoretical generalization on the one hand has an element of seeing whether the theory can explain the data. And on the other hand, it has another element that whether the data can illustrate the manner in which the theoretical propositions are at work in a specific case scenario. So that's what we mean by theoretical generalization. Now, when you are carrying out this particular form of generalization, either explicitly or implicitly, you would carry out three highly interrelated and somewhat overlapping analytical activities. three analytical activities. The first one is what I call theorization. As I already mentioned, theorization means the use of social theories to interpret your data. Instead of statistics, you are using theoretical propositions, theoretical arguments, theoretical concepts, and theoretical doctrines to provide a meaning, an analysis, or interpretation to your case-specific observations. That is the theorization. So by doing that, you connect your case to the theory and you twine your data with the theory. And second element is what I call contextualization. What I mean by contextualization is locating your case in its wider context. And that wider context can be the cultural, political, economic, global, and so on. So basically what you are trying to do is you have a set of case-specific observations, something happening in this particular case, and certain innovations happen here, certain new form of management control is implemented here. So when you are going to analyze that one, you might locate it with the wider context or wider historical context. For example, you may interpret and contextualize that particular observation as an element of globalization, an element of neoliberalization, an element of post-colonization, element of colonization, and so on. So there are various kind of sociological phenomena. We often talk in the word of either isations or isms, like capitalism, socialism, globalization, virtualization, digitalization, and so on. So you locate your case-specific findings within such a contextualizing elements, phenomena. It's called contextualization. So you do that while you are carrying out the theorization. So while you are doing theorization and doing contextualization, you also carry out a third analytical activity, which I call particularization. Now, particularization means you are explaining the manner in which your particular case is unique. Yes, you can say it is in a way connected to the totality, and it is in a way conceptualized in this particular manner as any other company. It is related to neoliberalization, it is related to the globalization, it is related to, say, for example, virtualization, digitalization, and so on. So therefore you see some connection between your particular case and the other cases and the other things happening around the world. So while you are seeing that commonality, while you are seeing that connection, you also see specificities. You see, yes, the globalization in this particular case scenario takes this particular form. It is a unique form, very specific for this particular company. Because individuals, companies, countries, nations, cultures behave differently. And they react to the same phenomena in so many different manners. Yes, globalization takes place. How globalization takes place in one country is not the manner in which it takes place in another country, in another company. Yes, neoliberalization takes place, but the manner in which neoliberalization happens is not the same in every locality, in every situation. So you have to explain how your specific case provide a very particular, very specific, very idiosyncratic example of happening something big. So that's what I call particularization. So in a broader sense, theoretical generalization refers to the manner in which we connect our case-specific findings to its totality through theory, through contextualization, and through particularization. So still we make the connection between the small, the element, the case, and the totality. But the totality is represented by theories and the context. And we make that connection through the particularization. So that's what we mean by theoretical generalization, which is the core of case study method. So with that discussion on theoretical generalization, we have effectively come to the end of conceptual elements of this particular topic. So logically, this is a good point to have a break. So I break this lecture here and call what we discussed so far as the part 1 of case study method lecture. So come back again to the part 2, where I will be discussing the technical and procedural aspects of doing a case study research. So until then, thank you very much for watching this lecture and goodbye.